Hi everyone. So this week we're going to be talking about the programming parts of speech. So as we mentioned in class last week, programming languages are languages, and actually the way that we write programs in many ways follows the conventions of the ways that we write stories. And so before you watch this video, you should have looked at the slide deck called "Programming Parts of Speech." Just to familiarize yourself with some of the concepts that we're going to kind of test out actually, in the browser in our code today, playing around with a couple of things, sort of seeing how these behave and how they function. I'm gonna ask for forgiveness right now. I still have a head cold, so I sound a little nasally, and I may cough at times. So don't turn the volume up too loud. Anyhow, so we're going to begin as we always do in Aptana. Again, I've just kind of launched, and I'm in my quote-unquote workspace here, my data viz folder. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually just going to work in the existing file that I already have. If you remember in the review video from last week, I created an HTML file, I put it in a folder, I quote-unquote promoted that folder to a project after I right-clicked using oh, it's not here because it's already a project. But I right-clicked and promoted it to a project so that it was available here. And inside this folder, I have my web page. So I'm going to go ahead and open this in Aptana. And in here, I'll see, I have these divs and comments, some of the stuff that we looked at last week. So as we mentioned in class, again, we have sort of there's sort of three main technologies that we use on the web. There's HTML, which provides the structure to our web page, right? So our div tags, our body tag, our HTML tag, perhaps not surprisingly. These are all HTML tags, and they provide the structure that we sort of put content into, that we add style and display qualities to through CSS, cascading style sheets, and that we add interactivity to via JavaScript. So we've seen a little bit about how the structure works, how we can add divs, how we can use CSS to control the positioning and look and feel of those divs, and we'll obviously look at other things. Although in fairness, 90% of the stuff that's on the web is inside of divs. So there aren't actually that many structures to learn when it comes to HTML. And today what we're going to look at is we're going to start playing around with JavaScript. And so JavaScript, like CSS, in most applications or in most cases, we'll actually put it in a separate file outside of our HTML file. But just, to sort of get going here, we're going to start by putting it in the HTML. And we do that with a special HTML tag called the script tag, and this signals to the browser that there is script, specifically JavaScript, or typically JavaScript, between these tags, and therefore it should interpret what is between those tags as such, right? So it gives us a little kind of out to say, oh, okay, all of this stuff that you've been doing with the divs, hey, that's all HTML. This bit, step aside, fork off here and treat this as script, and then you can come back and treat the rest of this as HTML. So the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about variables and types of variables. And if you remember in class last week, I made this analogy that I think hopefully will sort of resonate with you guys, which is about this idea of, when introducing information in a program is very similar to the way that we introduce people and use references to them in a story. So for example, if I were writing a story, I might have something, and I'm going to do this in comments here. You'll see that for JavaScript, we indicate comments with 2 slashes. When we're inside those script tags or in a JavaScript file, those 2 forward slashes make a comment the same way that this syntax does in HTML. It'll get a little bit more straightforward when we have them in separate file types. But, if I wanted to put the, meet Mr. Smith, like let's say that was the first, and I apologize for the stereotypicness of this of this reference, but okay, let's say that was the first line of my story. The way that I would write that in code is var, and I can't put periods in my variable names. But basically, I would say var Mr. Smith, meet Mr. Smith, var Mr. Smith. So what does the var keyword do here? What it does is it basically tells the computer, hey, I want you to create a box in memory, and I want you to label it with Mr. Smith, which is with the name Mr. Smith, which is basically what we do when somebody says meet Mr. Smith, right? That's a valid sentence. Um, kind of a cagey way to start a story, but basically what we're saying is, okay, there is a character in this story whose name is Mr. Smith. We don't know anything about him at this point other than his name. So var Mr. Smith. So create a box in memory called Mr. Smith. Okay? And so one of the things that we can do inside of our script is at any point in time, we can ask the computer what it knows about the things that we have, about the things that we've already described to it. So again, if you were reading this story, and you only got to read that one line, meet Mr. Smith. If someone were to ask you, what do you know about Mr. Smith? You'd say, nothing, right? Like, I know his name, so I can tell you that there is one. I know that that exists, but I don't know anything about it. It turns out that our computer can do the same thing, and it does this via something called, we can have it tell us this, right? We can sort of question it and interview our code via something called the console function. So the console function, or sorry, the console log function. And basically what this does is when I write console log and I put something in there, for example, I say, hey, what do you know about Mr. Smith? And what will happen is when I load this page in a web browser, there is a special place, I'll see this in a second, where I can have this console, where I can look at this console, and this console log function will spit out the result. It will speak back to me and say, this is what I know about Mr. Smith. Okay, so I've gone ahead and saved that file, so let's try that out. So I'm going to open up Chrome in this case. Is handy for this. It has these features kind of built in, and actually the easiest way for me to get to this is going to be to open up. Okay. So you'll notice that nothing visibly has changed, right? Because we haven't used our JavaScript to actually manipulate any of the HTML or any of the content, right? And HTML and the content still defines what is visible on the page. But under the hood here, I know that I have this this console log statement, so I'm going to go looking for it. So I'm going to right-click on my page and choose Inspect Element. And, oh, this has come unhooked here. I would like to get it hooked back together. Murph. All right. Well, we'll work with this for now. For most of you, it will appear kind of locked into the bottom of your browser window. But if you look across the tabs, we see Elements, Network Sources, Timeline, Profiles, Resources, Audits, Console, right? Lots of stuff. For now, we're just going to concern ourselves with the Console tab. And so what does it say? It says undefined. So that undefined is the result of my having asked the computer, having asked the browser, well, what do you know about Mr. Smith? And it says undefined. It means undefined is computer code for saying, I don't know anything. Now, this is different, I should point out, from the computer not having heard of Mr. Smith at all, right? It knows that Mr. Smith exists. It's heard, it's like, right, yeah, you said something about Mr. Smith, or you said that there is a Mr. Smith, but I don't know anything about this person. Very similar, by contrast, right? If we were to say console log, let's say Ms. Marks, I have no idea where I'm getting these names. Okay, so what's going to happen here? Well, let's find out. If I say, oh, okay, what do you know about Mr. Smith? Undefined. I don't know anything about Mr. Smith other than his name. I know that there is one. I say, okay, well, what can you tell me about Ms. Marks? Remember, this line of code is, at this point, our entire story. We have written a single sentence of our programming story at this point. And so if I come back here, and hold on, I've got to get my console log window up here, and I reload the page every time I have to save my changes, reload the page, and I'm going to see the results of my console logs in this window. And I did that. Uh-oh. Uncaught reference error. Ms. Marks is not defined. So what does that mean? It means that I've done this thing where I only have one sentence. All my sentence does is say there is a Mr. Smith there will be a Mr. Smith in this story. And then I asked about Ms. Marks, and the computer goes, I don't know who you're talking about. You haven't even introduced me to this person. And this is essentially what, this is not an uncommon thing. Usually it's a result of a typo. But again, it's just to sort of reinforce this idea that when we write a program, we follow many of the same conventions in a story. You can't talk about a person you haven't yet introduced, right? You have to at least say, hey, there is this character. So those are two of sort of the basic ideas in terms of declaring variables and also understanding what happens when we try to use a variable that hasn't been declared. So let's talk a little bit about those quote-unquote programming parts of speech. We're going to start with strings here, and then we'll move on to a few of them. Strings are going to be our, pretty common, right? Basically, what I can say is, okay, so let me create another one. I'm going to say, let's say, Mr. Smith owns a store. So var store name. Okay, store name. Whoops, can I spell? Okay, equals Smith's Bakery. Okay, so I want you guys to notice a couple things about this. I have said, this is sort of the equivalent of saying, there is a store, its name is Smith's Bakery. Okay? This equals sign is what we call an assignment operator. So if what this does is say, look, create a box in memory and call it Mr. Smith, what this does is it goes one step further. It says, create a box in memory, label it store name. Sorry, this is going to run off the edge here. Just do some formatting for fun. Okay, create a box of memory, label its store name, and then in that box, put Smith's Bakery. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is when we put this equals sign, we're saying, look, here I want you to create a box, that's the var. This is the label I want you to put on the box. That's the store name. And then inside that box, that's the equal sign. I want you to put Smith's Bakery. That's all for now, right? The semicolon is, we're done. That sentence is written. So now we can take a look and see what comes out when we look up store name. So again, I'm going to come back to my, I have to get this console log window locked down because it's going to keep doing this. Okay, and sorry for all the switching, right? And now we see, okay, Mr. Smith, still don't know anything about him, but I know that the name of the store is Smith's Bakery. Smith's Bakery in this case is a string, and I know it's a string, or I've informed the computer that it's a string because it is surrounded by double quotation marks. That is the signal that something should be treated as a string, even if, for example, it looks like a number. So in the next video, we're going to come back and we're going to look at numbers, arrays, and objects, which are kind of the remainder of our parts of speech. And you'll see very quickly, and booleans. So what you'll see is that we actually literally have a handful of parts of speech, and that's kind of it. And as you guys get more familiar with these, you'll see how they can be sort of used and composed in various areas to make, sort of complex, not super complex, but, functional programs that make things happen and sort of tell a story in code the same way that we would put words together to tell a story in journalism. So I will be back in a moment.